how Damascus steel was made, and then forgotten for centuries. Across the sweep of human history, there are materials so remarkable that they seem to belong to legend as much as fact. Damascus steel is one of them. For centuries, blades forged from this mysterious metal were prized from India to the Levant to medieval Europe. They were said to be so sharp they could cleave a feather in midair, so resilient they could bend almost double and spring straight again. Their beauty, marked by rippling, watery patterns flowing across the surface, only deepened their allure. And then, just as mysteriously, the knowledge of how to make them vanished. By the time European metallurgists tried to decipher the secret, the last masters were gone. Their forges were cold, their methods reduced to rumor and fragmentary accounts. It would take generations before modern science began to illuminate how these extraordinary weapons had once been created, and why the process slipped into oblivion. This is the story of Damascus steel, a tale of craftsmanship, trade, conquest, and loss. Over 15 chapters, you will travel from the crucible workshops of ancient India to the royal armories of the Middle East and the curious laboratories of Enlightenment Europe. Along the way, you will see how a singular material rose to prominence and why it was destined, eventually, to become an enigma. Chapter 1. What's in the South? Long before the word Damascus was whispered across Europe, before merchants carried blades east and west, a subtler transformation was taking place in the southern lands of India. There, in the Deccan Plateau, artisans had begun refining a process that would one day birth the steel that mesmerized kings and generals alike. They called it woods. The earliest mentions of this steel appear in Sanskrit texts describing smelting and forging. It was not ordinary iron, but something closer to alchemy, a crucible steel melted until liquid and cooled in sealed vessels. The process began with iron, ore carefully selected for its purity, harvested from deposits in Tamilakam and Andhra. Local smiths smelted the ore alongside charcoal, adjusting the proportions with an intuition honed over generations. In small clay crucibles, the iron absorbed carbon from the charcoal until the entire mass became saturated. At the right temperature, hot enough to liquefy, but not so fierce as to burn away the carbon, molten steel pooled at the bottom. The smiths watched the color of the fire, the movement of the slag, and the subtle shifts in the heat. When it was ready, the crucibles were allowed to cool slowly, encasing the solidified steel inside. The result was a puck or ingot of high-carbon metal, dark and glassy. To the untrained eye, it looked unremarkable. But when reheated and forged into blades, it revealed a quality of hardness and flexibility unknown in most ironworking. Here was a steel that could take a fine edge and hold it, that could bend without snapping. By the time of Alexander's campaigns in the 4th century BCE, Indian steel had already begun to circulate beyond the subcontinent. Greek historians wrote in wonder about swords that cut through ordinary iron weapons. Plutarch described Indian steel as a marvel, though he did not know the hidden chemistry that made it so. Wootz ingots traveled by caravan routes across Persia and into Mesopotamia, traded along with spices and gemstones. Some were carried northward to Armenia and the Caucasus, where local smiths experimented with forging the strange black metal. But it was in Syria that the true flowering of the craft would occur centuries later. While knowledge of crucible steel migrated, the techniques for working it were closely guarded. Indian metallurgists developed a discipline of secrecy, protecting recipes that blended practical observation with a sense of ritual. The exact type of charcoal, the purity of the ore, the length of time the crucibles remained sealed. All were factors that could not be reduced to written formula alone. Instead, they were passed from master to apprentice in words and gestures embedded in local custom. At the same time, the Indian subcontinent was a patchwork of kingdoms and guilds. Ironworking communities were bound together by caste, trade networks, and local patronage. Rulers understood that the skill of steelmaking was an economic and military asset. Guilds paid taxes and tribute in ingots, ensuring that control over production remained intertwined with political power. The crucible itself was an elegant solution to a metallurgical challenge. Ordinary bloomery iron, produced by heating or without fully liquefying it, always retained some impurities and variations. Forging could refine it further, but it could not match the consistency of fully molten steel. In contrast, Wood's crucibles produced a homogeneous alloy with carbon content high enough to transform its properties completely. When the ingots arrived in Syria centuries later, the black pucks would be carefully broken open, revealing their fine, crystalline texture. But in this earliest phase, they remained an Indian secret. Traders knew only that somewhere to the south, small furnaces glowed in the night, and men with darkened hands coaxed something extraordinary out of earth and fire. Modern metallurgists have studied surviving fragments of crucibles and pucks found in southern India. Chemical analysis confirms the remarkable uniformity of carbon distribution, something no European iron could match before the modern era. They have measured traces of vanadium and other elements that subtly influence the final patterns and strength. Even today, recreating what's in precisely the same form requires a level of control difficult to achieve. These early Wood's ingots were the seed of what would become Damascus steel. Without them, no Syrian smith could have forged the blades that would later astonish crusaders and inspire legends. In the Deccan Plateau's furnace pits, under the flicker of charcoal flames, the story of Damascus steel began, not in Damascus itself, but in the quiet, disciplined work of Indian metallurgists. It was here that the first chapter was written, a chapter of patience, secrecy, and the hidden transformation of ordinary ore into something approaching myth. Chapter 2: Caravans to Damascus. As centuries passed, the trails of trade braided themselves more thickly across the deserts and mountains of West Asia. Camel caravans wound through Persia and Syria, their panniers loaded with indigo, silk, and spice. But among the most valued cargoes were those dark, dense ingots of crucible steel. They traveled under many names: Pulad in Persian, Fulad in Arabic, Ukku in parts of India. To the merchants and smiths of Syria, they were simply the raw promise of unmatched blades. By the early Islamic centuries, Damascus had emerged as a vibrant center of trade and craftsmanship. The Umayyad dynasty and later rulers cultivated the city as a place of learning and commerce. Markets bustled with goods from every direction: Chinese ceramics, Egyptian linens, Arabian incense, and Indian steel. The ingots arrived wrapped in cloth, marked discreetly so that experienced buyers could distinguish the highest grades. While the steel itself came from India, the forging techniques that would shape it into weapons were refined in Syrian and Persian workshops. Over time, local smiths discovered how to bring out the ingot's hidden beauty. When the steel was heated and hammered with great care, cooled and reheated in precise cycles, the blades developed the rippling surface patterns that became synonymous with Damascus steel. These patterns were not mere decoration. They arose from subtle differences in carbon content and carbide formation within the steel. Modern metallurgists call this microstructure cementite. As the smith worked the metal, bands of cementite aligned with the direction of hammering. When the blade was polished and etched with acid, those layers appeared as waves, rivers, or ladder-like stripes glinting in the light. In the Damascus of the Abbasid period, such blades were not only weapons. They were tokens of prestige, fit gifts between rulers. Chroniclers recorded swords given as tribute, carried as diplomatic offerings, or ransomed for princely sums. Arab poets compared their shimmering surfaces to flowing water or the stripes of rare animals. The forging process itself remained partly hidden behind the closed doors of the smithy. Travelers described glowing hearths and rhythmic hammer blows, but few could say precisely how the patterns emerged. Some believed secret ingredients were sprinkled on the steel. Others speculated that a hidden tempering oil was responsible. In truth, it was the combination of carefully controlled thermal cycling and the inherited skill of generations. The The city's reputation grew with each blade that reached foreign shores. Crusaders in the 12th century encountered Damascus swords and returned home astonished by their sharpness. European chroniclers wrote of weapons that could sever helmets, pierce mail, and slice lesser blades in half. Whether every such tale was true is impossible to know, but the awe was real. Trade guilds arose to protect the methods of working imported woods. Blacksmith families passed their techniques through tightly knit circles. Contracts bound apprentices to years of service before they could open their own forges. Competition between workshops was fierce, each vying for the favor of merchants and patrons. A single blade, if judged perfect, could secure a workshop's reputation for decades. Over time, Damascus became both a place and an idea. While some of the most famous forges operated in the city itself, others flourished in nearby towns: Aleppo, Hama, Baghdad. Yet to Europeans, all blades with a distinctive flowing pattern became known by the city's name. The reputation of Damascus eclipsed the older Indian origin, though Indian smiths continued to supply the raw ingots. Travelers such as Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo observed the thriving trade in steel. They marveled at the markets where piles of ingots waited to be purchased by master smiths. They recorded that merchants sometimes paid in gold coin for a single shipment. So vital was the material to the armaments of the age. While the caravans made their steady journeys across arid lands, they carried more than a commodity. They bore a technology and a tradition, an understanding of how to turn brittle-looking lumps into blades of elegance and strength. In each caravan, the memory of Indian crucibles mingled with the Syrian genius for forging, giving rise to a synthesis that no single culture could claim alone. By the 13th century, Damascus steel had become a fixture of legend and trade alike. European knights yearned for it, and Islamic emirs wielded it with pride. And still, the caravans came, their cargoes wrapped in dusty cloth, traveling the same routes their forebears had followed for centuries. It was here, in the workshops that ringed the markets of Damascus, that the craft would achieve its greatest heights, before the slow erosion of memory, resources, and political stability would set in motion the long forgetting that followed. Chapter 3: The Secrets of the Forge. Within the walls of Damascus and its neighboring cities, the forge was more than a workplace. It was a guarded domain where knowledge passed from master to apprentice in whispers and gestures, never fully committed to parchment. For centuries, smiths preserved the techniques that transformed Wootz ingots into blades that seemed alive with pattern and impossible resilience. The heart of the process was the delicate art of thermal cycling. The steel ingot, once broken from its clay crucible, was first heated slowly to avoid cracking from internal stresses. This initial heating softened the mass enough for the smith to shape it into a bar. Each movement of the hammer had to be measured. Striking too hard could fracture the high-carbon matrix. Too gentle, and the steel would not compress evenly. When the bar reached the desired rough shape, the real work began. The smith reheated the steel in a charcoal fire, carefully monitoring the color, deep red to orange. The ingot would be brought to forging temperature, then removed for hammering, then returned to the fire again, over and over. These cycles served two purposes. They aligned the microscopic carbide structures into flowing bands and homogenized the carbon content across the blade. The forging was punctuated by periods of slow cooling. Unlike European pattern welding, where different irons were twisted and folded together, Damascus steel relied on the internal chemistry of a single crucible steel ingot. In this way, the patterns were not laid on top, but emerged from within, revealed as the smith coaxed the matrix into alignment. Even the tools were specialized. Hammers of varied weights allowed the smith to shift pressure without bruising the metal. Tongs were shaped to grip the increasingly slender blade without marring its surface. Clay-lined furnaces preserved the even heat necessary for long, controlled cycles. And always, the experienced eye judged progress not by time, but by the texture of the steel under the hammer. At a later stage, the blade underwent filing and polishing. This step removed the oxide scale and refined the surface. But the final transformation came through etching. The blade was washed in a weak acid, sometimes vinegar, sometimes more potent solutions, to darken the softer matrix and reveal the paler bands of carbide. Slowly, the blade's hidden rivers and ripples appeared. Accounts by medieval travelers describe Damascus workshops as places of almost ritual gravity. Apprentices worked in silence, passing tools and tending the fires. The master smith alone decided when a blade had been forged enough, when the heat had penetrated just to the core, when the cooling could begin. To outsiders, this process seemed magical or at least impossible to imitate. Some European observers believed the blades were quenched in secret fluids, blood of animals, oil mixed with herbs. Others suspected that incantations or talismans played a role. In reality, it was the disciplined repetition of heating and hammering that distinguished these weapons. No hidden potion could replace the mastery of thermal control. The resulting swords earned names of their own. In Arabic, the shamshir, the saif, the killage, each with regional variations of hilt and curve. In Europe, they were simply called Damascus blades, and their patterned surfaces were signs of authenticity. A finished blade combined contradictory virtues. It could take a keen edge and hold it through repeated blows. It could flex under force without snapping. And it possessed a beauty no plain steel could match. In some cases, the rippling lines seemed to move when turned in the light, as though the blade itself were liquid. Over generations, the forge became both workshop and vault of knowledge. A single family might guard the secrets of technique, refining them with each apprenticeship. Contracts bound apprentices to loyalty, and betrayal of the forge's knowledge was a grave offense. Some smiths refused to work outside their home cities for fear that their methods might be stolen. In the marketplaces of Damascus, weapons were tested in demonstrations that bordered on performance. A blade might be shown to slice through iron rods, sever silk scarves midair, or bend nearly to a circle before springing back unscathed. These feats were not tricks. They were the result of meticulous craft that began with the first spark in the hearth and ended with the final polish of the edge. By the 14th century, Damascus steel was an export commodity of renown. Caravans carried finished blades as far as Cairo, Constantinople, and the rising capitals of Europe. Yet even then, the secrets of the forge were fragile, dependent on a handful of families, a stable flow of Wood's ingots, and the political conditions that made trade possible. Few in those days could imagine that these carefully guarded methods would one day vanish almost completely. But the seeds of that forgetting were already planted in the shifting patterns of conquest, in the decline of old trade routes, and in the coming of new technologies that would transform metallurgy forever. The forge, for all its guarded knowledge, could not remain untouched by the tide of history. Chapter 4. The Patterns That Spoke. Among the many marvels of Damascus steel, none was so celebrated or so mysterious as its patterns. These flowing, wave-like designs captivated merchants and warriors alike. In a time when the appearance of a blade carried as much weight as its performance, the patterns were symbols of quality, prestige, and a hidden mastery that no rival could easily duplicate. Collectors and chroniclers devised their own terms for the visual motifs. Some called them watered steel, likening the shimmer to ripples on a pond. Others described them as ladder patterns, rose patterns, or Muhammad's ladder. Each blade was a unique composition, its markings arising from the internal structure of the steel rather than any decoration applied from without. To modern metallurgists, these designs were the surface revelation of the microstructure. High-carbon steel contains cementite, a hard, crystalline iron carbide. When a Wood's ingot cooled slowly inside its sealed crucible, the carbon diffused throughout, forming intricate networks of carbides within softer iron. The patterns were born of that lattice. Yet the smiths of Damascus did not think in terms of micrographs or chemistry. They relied on practice, intuition, and an inherited understanding that some ingots contained better potential than others. Experienced forge masters could judge the likely beauty of a blade by the first fracture lines when an ingot was struck. If the surface showed small, glinting specks, sometimes called stars, it was a sign that the steel held promise. Forging was a slow conversation with the material. The smith reheated the steel again and again, aligning the carbide bands through controlled hammering. If worked too hot or too cold, the patterns would become muddy or disappear altogether. Even a number of hammer blows between heating cycles could affect the result. When finally ground smooth and etched, the blade disclosed its secret geometry. In strong light, the ripples gleamed pale against the darker matrix. In shadow, they seemed to recede into the steel's depths. A well-made sword almost looked alive, as though it carried within it a current flowing from hilt to point. These patterns became a mark of authenticity. In bazaars and courtly gift exchanges, buyers inspected blades closely. A plain surface implied inferior steel. A richly figured one promised not only prestige, but lethal performance. To some, the patterns were a sign of divine favor or a testament to the virtues of their owner. In Persian poetry, the blade was often compared to the flowing tresses of a beloved or to the undulating desert dunes. European crusaders encountered these weapons in battle and returned home in wonder. Chroniclers wrote that no Frankish sword could match the edge or the grace of the Damascene blade. Knights purchased them when they could afford it. Others received them as trophies or tribute, carrying them back to castles where no local blacksmith could imitate the effect. When European metallurgists first tried to replicate the patterns, they suspected the secret lay in etching alone. They polished ordinary steel and applied acid, hoping for the same flowing designs. But their blades remained stubbornly plain. They could not yet know that the mystery was not in the acid or in the surface, but in the very structure of the steel itself, laid down during the first moments of the crucible's cooling. Back in Damascus, the smiths continued their work, largely indifferent to foreign curiosity. They judged their blades by utility and form alike. A sword must be hard enough to hold an edge, resilient enough to flex in combat, and beautiful enough to honor the tradition it came from. The patterns were proof that the steel had been transformed properly, that the forge's careful rituals had achieved their purpose. Not every ingot produced such beauty. Sometimes, despite all care, the patterns emerged dull or broken. Some smiths set these blades aside or reworked them into plainer tools. The most exceptional pieces were reserved for wealthy patrons, noble warriors, or diplomatic gifts. In time, these masterpieces spread far beyond Syria, ending up in royal armories, treasuries, and collections whose inventories were whispered about across continents. Over the centuries, a strange duality emerged. Damascus steel was both widespread as an export and fiercely secretive in its making. The basic principles were known: high carbon woods, repeated forging cycles, acid etching, but the precise feel of the hammer, the timing of each heat, the judgment of when to quench or cool slowly. These were personal, inherited skills that no text could fully record. Some artisans came to believe that the patterns themselves had protective properties. Legends grew that the ripples could deflect a blade or ward off evil. Such beliefs were rarely written in the sober inventories of merchants, but they traveled along trade routes, adding to the mythos of Damascus steel. In modern laboratories, scanning electron microscopes have revealed the hidden networks of cementite that gave rise to the flowing designs. But no analysis has ever fully replaced the ancient intuition of the smiths who stood over glowing hearths, their eyes trained on subtle signs invisible to all others. The patterns, in the end, were more than decoration. They were a record of the material's journey, from Indian ore to crucible, from ingot to blade, and of the centuries of skill that shaped them. They were the visible trace of a vanished art. Chapter 5. The edge that could not be matched. To the warrior of the medieval world, a blade was more than a weapon. It was a companion, a status symbol, and sometimes the final judge of life and death. And no blades commanded greater respect or deeper superstition than those made of Damascus steel. Soldiers, travelers, and emissaries told stories of edges so keen they could part silk in midair. One account claimed that a Damascus sword could slice through a gauze veil simply by letting it fall across the blade's edge. Another insisted that a skilled swordsman could strike a helmet or a shield rim and leave the steel unscathed while lesser blades shattered. Though some of these tales were embellished, they sprang from consistent observation. Damascus blades were remarkably sharp and stayed sharp. Part of this performance came from the carbon content. Wood steel often contained around 1.5% carbon, higher than most European steels of the time. This high carbon allowed a harder edge when carefully tempered. Yet the crucible process also distributed microscopic carbides in a way that resisted fracture. The result was a blade with a cutting surface of enduring hardness, embedded within a matrix flexible enough to withstand impacts. Modern metallography has revealed that these carbides formed in distinct networks, following the thermal gradients of cooling. When a blade was forged, the smith preserved those patterns by controlling the hammering and reheating. Unlike brittle cast iron or soft wrought iron, which had a complex internal landscape, carbides that could take a razor edge and a softer phase that could absorb shock. To a warrior, the proof was in the battlefield. In the Crusades, knights who captured sword from Muslim armies often prized them above any ransom. Chronicles record entire regiments armed with blades that had been traded, stolen, or gifted across generations. These swords were not necessarily forged in Damascus itself. Many came from smaller centers of production in the Levant or Persia. Yet the name Damascus became a catch-all term for any steel with the same rippling beauty and extraordinary edge. The swords took many forms. Some were straight-edged with a simple crossguard, suitable for thrusting and cutting. Others curved gracefully into scimitars, optimized for sweeping strikes from horseback. Regardless of shape, the performance was consistent. These were weapons made to endure. European smiths could not replicate them. Pattern welding techniques in the Frankish and Viking traditions produced decorative lines, but these were made by twisting and folding different kinds of iron and steel together, not by cultivating internal carbides in a single alloy. Attempts to simply forge high-carbon iron failed because the material cracked or lost its temper under clumsy hammering. With every campaign, the mystique of Damascus blades deepened. A knight might attribute his survival to the miraculous quality of the steel. A chronicler might ascribe a decisive victory to the superiority of enemy swords. Stories spread that the techniques had been gifted by jinn, or that secret quenching rituals invoked blessings. Some European rulers tried to commission their own shipments. Kings and dukes dispatched envoys to Damascus with chests of coin to acquire blades in bulk. The demand grew so great that some merchants sold lesser quality imitations, blades etched to resemble the real patterns but forged from ordinary steel. These fakes were eventually recognized in battle, and the name of Damascus became a mark that had to be proven by demonstration as much as by appearance. In Damascus itself, the forging houses maintained their slow, rigorous pace. Each blade took weeks, sometimes months, from raw ingot to finished sword. Customers waited with impatience while apprentices tended the fires and masters inspected every phase of the process. Only when the pattern shimmered perfectly under acid wash and the edge passed a series of tests was the blade considered worthy of sale. Some swords were given names and lineages tracked across generations. In Persian and Arabic chronicles, particular blades appear by name, credited with victories or losses. A blade might serve father and son, carried from one campaign to the next. Over time, these weapons became family heirlooms as much as instruments of war. Today, when metallurgists study fragments of these ancient blades, they find evidence of careful tempering that European forges could not match until the industrial era. Advanced microscopy shows the carbide networks that made the edge so resilient. Even with modern furnaces, it takes extraordinary precision to reproduce the same distribution. Yet in their own time, these blades were more than technical achievements. They were symbols of an artisan culture in which patience, observation, and inherited knowledge joined in perfect balance. Each blade was proof that beauty and function need not be separated, that a weapon could be a work of art as well as an instrument of survival. The edge that could not be matched was not the product of any single innovation, but of centuries of refinement, trial, and memory. And while armies marched and empires rose and fell, the forges of Damascus remained, quietly shaping steel into legend. Chapter 6: The Spread of a Legend. As the centuries advanced and trade routes pulsed with new exchanges of ideas and goods, the legend of Damascus steel outgrew the narrow lanes of Syrian markets. From Cairo to Constantinople, from Delhi to Venice, merchants and emissaries spoke of swords whose edges could part armor and whose patterns shimmered like water caught in moonlight. Word of their qualities traveled faster than the caravans themselves, carried by soldiers returning from campaigns and by diplomats intent on impressing their courts. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Damascus blades had become a symbol of status across many cultures. Mamluk sultans commissioned them in batches, presenting them as gifts to loyal generals and foreign dignitaries. Ottoman warriors took to calling them by honorific titles, each blade sometimes given a personal name that would pass down through families like an inheritance. European nobles traded entire estates for a single sword. In Italian city-states, wealthy collectors placed Damascus blades in display cabinets beside illuminated manuscripts and relics of saints. Yet even as demand soared, the true origin of the steel remained partly hidden. Few European customers understood that the heart of these weapons lay in Wood's ingots shipped from India. To them, Damascus was both the place of forging and the final guarantee of quality. The names of the Deccan mines and the quiet crucible workshops were almost never mentioned in ledgers or correspondence. This concealment, intentional or accidental, helped keep the myth intact. When Mongol conquests swept across the Islamic world, they disrupted trade for decades. Some of the caravan routes through Persia and Central Asia fell into chaos. Yet even amid this upheaval, the allure of Damascus steel endured. New conquerors valued the blades just as highly as their predecessors. In some chronicles, Mongol generals are said to have demanded tribute in swords as well as silver. European attempts to imitate the material grew more desperate as the reputation of Damascus steel eclipsed anything their own forges could produce. In France and the German states, smiths experimented with mixing high and low-carbon iron, folding them again and again in hope that the swirling designs would appear. While these methods sometimes yielded strong swords, they never quite replicated the distinctive patterns or the resilience of true crucible steel. Venetian merchants began to circulate partial descriptions of the forging process, usually based on hearsay. One account insisted that the steel owed its sharpness to secret quenching oils made from date pits and herbs. Another claimed the patterns resulted from dipping the blade alternately in brine and goat's milk. These stories, repeated in workshop after workshop, only deepened the aura of mystery. Meanwhile, in Damascus and other Levantine cities, the smiths continued their slow, deliberate production. Their techniques were not locked in a single formula. Different workshops had slightly different approaches to forging temperature, to hammering rhythm, to the angle at which the blade was drawn out from the ingot. Some masters preferred long, slender swords, others broader, heavier sabers. Yet the common thread was always the painstaking observation of the steel's changing character under heat. A Damascus blade's passage from ingot to finished weapon was as much an art as a science. Each piece was unique. Even when two smiths worked from the same ingot, their results would differ subtly in feel and appearance. The difference lay in the temperament and judgment of the artisan, a quality that no recipe could reduce to steps. As Ottoman power expanded through Anatolia and the Balkans, the trade in these blades reached new heights. Turkish cavalry prized the long, curving sabers for their combination of speed and cutting power. From the Balkans, some of these swords filtered north into Poland and Hungary, where they influenced local designs. By the Renaissance, European chroniclers had begun to describe Damascus steel in increasingly reverent terms. Some called it the metal of the East. Others insisted it had magical properties. In an era of chivalric spectacle, to carry a blade marked with the signature ripples was proof of refinement as much as of martial prowess. Yet few realized how fragile the chain of knowledge truly was. The supply of Wootz ingots depended on the continued operation of mines and crucible furnaces thousands of miles away. Any disruption, political turmoil, trade embargoes, shifts in patronage, could imperil the flow of raw material. And the forging expertise itself remained concentrated in a handful of lineages. Even at the height of Damascus steel's fame, the seeds of its decline were sown. European steelmaking slowly advanced through the introduction of blast furnaces and improved refining methods. Ottoman wars and shifting alliances would eventually strain the economies that supported the master forges. And as firearms began to eclipse swords as the decisive instruments of war, the demand for such blades would falter. But in these centuries of spread and triumph, Damascus steel stood as a symbol of an age when craft and material knowledge shaped power as surely as armies did. The legend of its unmatched edge and its liquid patterns entered the imaginations of poets and chroniclers alike, preparing the ground for the long centuries of speculation and longing that would follow its disappearance. Chapter 7. The Long Decline. Though Damascus steel's legend was secure, the practical foundations that sustained it began to erode slowly, almost imperceptibly, over the centuries. No single catastrophe extinguished the craft, but rather a gradual accumulation of pressures, shifting trade, technological change, political upheaval, and the loss of crucial knowledge passed by word and demonstration, not by pen and parchment. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the caravans from India still carried Wootz ingots, but the quantities dwindled. Warfare in the Deccan disrupted production. Some mines were abandoned or fell under the control of new rulers who demanded higher tribute, making the ingots more expensive. Other regions suffered from resource depletion as centuries of mining had exhausted easily accessible ore. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire's expanding military relied increasingly on firearms and artillery. The sword remained a mark of rank and ceremony, but the battlefield was no longer decided by blades alone. The armies of Europe were undergoing parallel transformations, investing in pikes, muskets, and cannon. These developments meant fewer patrons were willing to pay a premium for the most refined Damascus blades. In Damascus itself, the old forges continued to operate, but their guilds struggled. Some masters died without heirs or apprentices who could absorb the full tradition. Others saw their businesses collapse under the costs of dwindling supply. As demand contracted, fewer merchants risked long journeys to secure ingots, further constricting the trade networks. European metallurgists tried to fill the gap with new methods. Blast furnaces in Germany and England began to produce steels of greater consistency, though not the same internal structure as Wootz. Pattern welding techniques were refined to create decorative surfaces that mimicked the flowing lines of true Damascus steel. To the untrained eye, such blades looked convincing, but their performance never matched the original. The problem was not merely the raw material, but the experiential knowledge that had governed every stage of forging. A smith who knew how to read the ingot's response to hammer and fire could coax out the hidden patterns. Without that hard-won intuition, no amount of imported or foreign observation could replace centuries of tradition. Travelers of the 17th and 18th centuries still recorded glimpses of authentic Damascus forging. Some described dark workshops where elderly masters labored with few apprentices to assist them. Others noted that blades once considered common had become rarities, locked away in treasuries and prized by collectors rather than carried into war. Even as the craft declined, the mythology around it only grew. European scholars and antiquarians, starved of reliable information, filled the gaps with speculation. Some wrote that the blades were quenched in dragon's blood. Others claimed they were hammered under eclipses or infused with meteoric iron. Without widespread first-hand experience, such tales multiplied unchecked. By the early 19th century, a handful of surviving smiths in Syria and Persia still possessed enough skill to forge something close to the classic patterns. But the steady erosion of trade had made high-quality ingots almost impossible to secure. The last generation of masters worked with whatever stock remained, often recycling old blades or scraps rather than starting anew. Meanwhile, European industries marched ahead. The Industrial Revolution brought rolling mills, crucible steel made by new processes, and factory production of blades. Sheffield and Zollingen rose to prominence, creating affordable swords and cutlery at scales unthinkable in the Levantine guilds. In this environment, the old slow craft became unsustainable. A few travelers in the early 1800s, including British officers and French savants, tried to document the techniques before they vanished. Their notes captured fragments, forging temperatures, descriptions of etching solutions, observations about how the metal sounded under the hammer. But none could extract the full depth of knowledge transmitted by demonstration and repetition. When the last traditional workshops closed or turned to more conventional blacksmithing, no comprehensive written record existed to guide later metallurgists. The once unbroken line of masters and apprentices had finally been severed. In the lands where Damascus steel had been born and perfected, it became simply a memory. Yet the blades themselves survived, hidden in treasuries, hung on palace walls, carried as heirlooms across continents. Some were misidentified or neglected. Others were studied in growing fascination by European collectors. The legends they had inspired in the medieval era persisted, gathering new layers of romance and speculation. It was the paradox of Damascus steel's decline. As the practical craft withered, the myth flourished. The fewer the genuine blades in circulation, the more precious and mysterious they became. And as decades passed, the longing to rediscover the old methods would draw scientists, metallurgists, and adventurers into long quests to unlock the secrets that had slipped away almost without notice in the quiet decline of the Levant's last forges. Chapter 10: Rediscovery Attempts. Through the mid-20th century, the industrial age pressed on, and yet Damascus steel refused to fade from fascination. As researchers gained access to more sophisticated tools, electron microscopes, X-ray diffraction, precision thermal controls, they were newly determined to solve the enigma. What was it about the old crucible process in the smith's hands that no modern factory could duplicate? In Britain, metallurgist Cyril Stanley Smith made extensive studies of ancient steels, including the fabled Damascus blades. His work emphasized that the properties came not only from the chemical makeup, but from controlled cooling and forging that preserved an intricate microstructure. Meanwhile, in the United States, scientists at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology pored over surviving samples under the electron microscope. They documented rows of cementite particles aligned like tiny rivers, flowing along the length of the blade. One hypothesis suggested that the patterns were simply a byproduct of slow cooling and the segregation of carbides as the ingot solidified in the crucible. This idea, elegant in its simplicity, explained why the patterns resisted replication. Industrial steelmaking prized homogeneity, while the ancient process relied on natural variation. To modern metallurgists, these impurities would have been defects. To the old smiths, they were the heart of the blade's strength and character. In Germany, interest also surged. Zollingen, once the rival of Damascus in sword production, was home to a new generation of metallurgists who experimented with replicating the distinctive waves. Using carefully controlled high-carbon steels and etching treatments, they managed to produce superficially similar appearances, but the cutting performance remained elusive. Even when carbon content approached that of genuine woods, the internal architecture, the famous cementite networks, did not appear in quite the same way. Beyond technical journals, the broader public continued to romanticize Damascus steel. Adventure novels featured swashbuckling heroes wielding swords forged by forgotten masters. Collectors scoured antique shops, hoping to find a genuine blade among more common 19th century imitations. In museums, curators debated whether certain examples were authentic or later reproductions. For even in their decline, the forges had created blades that blended traditional techniques with more recent compromises. It was in India, ironically, that the most promising rediscovery took place. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers began documenting surviving oral histories among families who once worked in crucible steel production. In a few villages of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, elders still remembered details. The shape of the crucible, the specific ratio of charcoal, the importance of slow heating over many hours. This research, coupled with field experiments, led to the successful melting of high-carbon ingots resembling ancient woods. Though not all attempts produced clear patterns, a few yielded blades whose etched surfaces displayed familiar water designs. It was a moment of both triumph and melancholy, proof that the old process could still work if one had the patience to follow every step without compromise. Yet even these successes did not mark a true return to mass production. Each attempt demanded painstaking care. The raw, or the precise conditions, and the slow forging rhythms were ill-suited to modern economies. No large-scale revival took place. Instead, the rediscovery became an exercise in homage, an acknowledgement that certain crafts could only flourish when time moved at the pace of the artisan's eye. Meanwhile, new scientific studies explored whether the composition of the ore itself had played a decisive role. Some researchers proposed that trace elements, vanadium, chromium, or phosphorus, could have influenced carbide formation. Others argued that the ore was less critical than the combination of crucible atmosphere and forging practice. At conferences and in specialized publications, debate continued. Was the cementite banding caused by the cooling gradient within the ingot? Was it by mechanical deformation during forging? Or was it the result of repeated cycles of partial melting and solidification over days? Each theory was tested, refined, or discarded. Among blacksmiths, the legend of Damascus steel inspired a different approach. Instead of pursuing identical microstructures, many modern bladesmiths embraced pattern welding. They fused multiple steels together in complex stacks, twisted and flattened them to create spectacular flowing designs. While technically different from ancient Damascus, these blades carried the same spirit, combining aesthetic beauty with practical strength. By the end of the 20th century, Damascus steel had become a bridge between worlds, the rigorous inquiry of materials science and the intuitive artistry of the forge. It was no longer a lost technique waiting to be rediscovered so much as a legacy to be respected, proof that mastery sometimes resided beyond formulae, in the delicate dance between material, heat, and the hand that guides the hammer. The rediscovery attempts, partial as they were, rekindled a respect for the old masters. Their quiet workshops, tucked behind city walls or perched along Indian riverbanks, had produced blades that defied the centuries. And as modern metallurgists peered deeper into the structure of those blades, they were reminded of a truth as relevant in laboratories as in forges. Some mysteries are solved not by conquering them, but by learning to appreciate their complexity. Chapter 11: Blades in the Archive. As the 21st century unfolded, the fascination with Damascus steel began to take on new dimensions. For centuries, the story had been one of mystique and gradual loss, of workshops falling silent, of knowledge passed through fire and hand rather than through books. But now, with the advent of digital archives, advanced imaging, and global collaboration, the world began to return not just to the blades themselves, but to the scattered records that surrounded them. In libraries across Europe and Asia, researchers began to re-examine old texts, not for grand narrative histories, but for small, almost incidental mentions of blade production. A forgotten line in a Persian poem, a scribbled note in the margin of an Ottoman inventory, a sketch beside a workshop diagram. Each became a potential clue. What emerged was not a single recipe for Damascus steel, but a mosaic of references that suggested a wide range of local variations and adaptations. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from a 10th century Arabic treatise on metallurgy preserved in Cairo. In it, the author described a process that involved wrapping iron bars in clay and heating them slowly for days before forging. Though it was not explicitly named as woods, the process echoed key features of crucible steelmaking: isolation from oxygen, slow carbon diffusion, and prolonged heating cycles. Such texts didn't solve the mystery, but they hinted at how widely shared and how carefully guarded the principles behind Damascus steel had once been. Elsewhere, in the archives of Hyderabad and Mysore, colonial administrators' reports from the early 1800s were re-evaluated with fresh eyes. They documented the habits of Indian steelmakers with a blend of admiration and misunderstanding. Where earlier scholars had dismissed these notes as quaint or vague, modern researchers now realized they contained detailed observations. The temperature color of a fire, the sound of a correctly cooled ingot when struck, the timing between quenching and reheating. These records, once neglected, gained new significance. They showed that the secrets of Damascus steel weren't locked in a single forge or a single city. Rather, they had circulated for centuries through oral teaching, quiet apprenticeship, and local trade, fragile channels that had been ruptured by industrialization and colonization. At the same time, museums began to revisit the provenance of the Damascus blades in their collections. Many pieces, long labeled generically as Islamic or Oriental, were reassessed with new metallographic techniques. Curators and material scientists worked together to map the microstructures of hundreds of surviving swords. These studies revealed important variations. Some blades bore the classic flowing pattern, with organized cementite structures. Others, while visually similar, had microstructures indicative of different methods, either later imitations or alternate traditions of high-carbon forging. One of the largest studies came from a collaboration between German museums and metallurgical institutes. Using non-invasive imaging and scanning electron microscopy, they analyzed 65 swords from the 12th to the 18th centuries. Their findings reinforced the idea that Damascus steel was not a monolith. The finest examples shared common traits: crucible origin, carbide banding, and low levels of sulfur or phosphorus. But other blades had evolved features, likely due to changing material sources or smithing techniques over time. Importantly, these efforts shifted the conversation from lost magic to recoverable process. Damascus steel was no longer a mystery because it had vanished. It was a mystery because its logic had never been reduced to writing. It had lived in the gestures of the smith, in the feel of the hammer, in the flicker of color at the edge of the fire. Some scholars now argue that the very term Damascus steel should be reconsidered. They suggest returning to more accurate distinctions, referring to woods-based crucible steel when speaking of the original Indian ingots, and using pattern-welded steel for later European imitations. Yet the public fascination remains tied to the older name. Damascus evokes not just steel, but an image, a sword shimmering with a watery pattern, forged in an age when metallurgy was both science and art. In academic conferences and artisan workshops alike, the conversation around Damascus steel became more collaborative. Blacksmiths and scientists exchanged notes. Historians consulted with material engineers. Blades, once removed from their making context, became again part of a dialogue, a global rediscovery project grounded not in nostalgia, but in respect for past complexity. The archive, whether composed of old manuscripts, museum inventories, or the blades themselves, became a living forge of sorts. Its sparks were not made of fire and coal, but of ideas, shared, tested, and tempered across disciplines and centuries. And as more blades were studied, more microstructures mapped, more text deciphered, a fuller picture emerged. Damascus steel was not a singular lost art. It was a constellation of knowledge, dispersed across lands and languages, waiting patiently in libraries and vitrines for hands curious and careful enough to listen. Chapter 12: The Modern Blade. By the early 21st century, Damascus steel had returned, not as a rediscovered ancient process in its original form, but as a revival, a reimagining, and a tribute. The ancient forge had not been fully restored, but modern artisans, metallurgists, and blacksmiths had begun building something new from its fragments. In workshops from North America to Japan, independent bladesmiths took up the hammer with renewed purpose. Using carbon steels of various grades, they forged bars together, folded them, twisted them, and welded them again, creating patterns reminiscent of the old blades. The technique, widely known as modern Damascus, is technically pattern-welded steel. Though chemically different from wood-based blades, its shimmering textures capture the imagination of both craftsmen and collectors. Unlike in the industrial past, this time the goal wasn't efficiency or mass replication. These new smiths worked slowly. They celebrated variation. Each billet of layered steel was unique. Some forged chef's knives, others made Japanese-style katanas, and a few focused exclusively on historical reproduction, painstakingly etching and etching again to simulate the watery surface that had once graced the weapons of kings and warriors. At the same time, scientific research on crucible steel continued. In Russia, India, Germany, and the United States, researchers studied and recreated the original Indian wood's method with increasing success. Teams at National Metallurgy Institutes conducted high-temperature experiments using crucibles made of locally sourced clay, iron ore with trace vanadium, and natural carbon sources like coconut shell charcoal. These controlled recreations revealed an important truth. The material was only part of the secret. Just as vital were the smith's hands and timing. When to reheat, how long to work the metal, when to cool it, and whether to hammer lightly or draw it thin. The modern experiments confirmed that the ancient masters had not just discovered a material, they had shaped a relationship with it. Perhaps one of the most meaningful outcomes of the 21st century revival was a change in mindset. The new wave of Damascus steel did not try to erase the centuries of loss. Instead, it honored the gaps as part of the story. The smiths did not claim to fully reproduce the past. They sought instead to converse with it, and their blades found an audience, not among warriors or generals, but among chefs, collectors, artists, and engineers. Damascus pattern blades became symbols of craftsmanship in an age dominated by automation. Their value lay not only in cutting ability or appearance, but in the quiet precision of their making. They were objects of slowness, of attention, of intentional beauty. In this way, the modern Damascus revival paralleled the story of the original. For while Damascus steel had once armed empires, its truest legacy was never in war. It was in the forge, the place where earth, fire, and human judgment met. That place still existed. It had merely changed its tools. The scientific community, too, evolved its view. Rather than chasing a singular loss formula, many researchers began thinking in terms of systems, of forging temperatures, cooling curves, trace elements, and microstructural evolution. Metallurgy papers increasingly referenced not just chemistry, but history. The Damascus story became a case study in the fragility of craft knowledge, and in how much of the world's technological past lives not in texts, but in touch. At conferences and exhibitions, museum curators, scientists, and blacksmiths began appearing side by side. They showed blades under the microscope, then passed around modern recreations. Some used 3D printed models to explain dendritic carbide formations. Others simply laid out ancient tools beside modern hammers. The boundaries between lab and workshop, archive and forge, blurred in productive, respectful ways. Digital platforms helped share the knowledge further. Blacksmiths posted high-resolution photos of their steel patterns, their crucible results, their failures. Conversations across continents unfolded in real time. A smith in Finland might ask a question about manganese levels, and an engineer in Hyderabad might respond within minutes. The global community of blade enthusiasts became a new kind of forge, one made of light and text rather than heat and hammer. Still, among the most prized were the few original blades. In national museums in London, Istanbul, Tehran, and St. Petersburg, security glass encased swords forged hundreds of years ago, still sharp, still patterned, still silently instructive. Their creators' names were forgotten, but their hands remained visible in every wave and ripple of steel. To look at one of these blades was to see not just a weapon, but a story. Of travel, of adaptation, of material and memory. A story that crossed languages and cultures, vanishing and reappearing like the patterns themselves. Emerging from the fire, shaped in silence, enduring far beyond their time. As the world hurtled deeper into an era of speed and scale, Damascus steel stood as an emblem of another way of knowing. Slow, precise, handcrafted, and deeply human. It invited not replication, but reflection. And in doing so, it ensured that even in the modern forge, the past would never quite be gone. Chapter 13. The Last Blades of Damascus. Among all the mysteries that surrounded Damascus steel, none was more haunting than the question of when the last true blades were forged. The decline had unfolded gradually, often without a clear awareness that an era was ending. For centuries, smiths continued to hammer steel into elegant forms, but the raw material, high-carbon crucible woods, had already begun to vanish from markets, replaced by cheaper alternatives that did not yield the same flowing beauty. By the mid-19th century, even in Damascus itself, the trade had become more about commerce than tradition. Travelers described rows of shops selling blades called Damascus, but most were pattern-welded or etched to simulate the classic look. Only a few swordsmiths still possessed ingots of true woods, and fewer still had the skill to work them without destroying their microstructure. One of the final documented examples of authentic crucible-wrought blades came from India in the princely state of Hyderabad. There, a handful of hereditary smiths preserved the practice into the late 1800s, supplying ceremonial weapons to local nobility. When British colonial officers acquired some of these swords as gifts or trophies, they noted that the blades bore the unmistakable watered pattern. Specimens entered museum collections in London and Calcutta, sometimes misattributed as Persian or Ottoman. These last masters knew that their craft was fading. Oral histories recorded in the 20th century spoke of smiths who guarded their techniques fiercely, but could find no apprentices willing to commit to years of apprenticeship. Industrial imports undercut local markets, and social upheaval reshaped priorities. Gradually, the old crucibles were abandoned. The bellows fell quiet. The question of exactly when the last Witt's blade was forged may never be answered with certainty. Some researchers propose dates as late as the 1920s, when a few Indian artisans reportedly continued small-scale smelting. Others argue that by the turn of the century, the craft was functionally extinct, sustained only in fragments and memory. While the forging practice slipped away, the blades themselves persisted, collected, studied, misunderstood, revered. Some were held by museums, their origins cataloged in neat ledgers. Others rested in private homes, passed from generation to generation, accumulating new legends. A few became ceremonial heirlooms for royal families, displayed but never wielded. In Istanbul, the Topkapi Palace preserved examples linked to Ottoman sultans, their hilts encrusted with jewels and Quranic inscriptions. In Iran, shrines displayed swords believed to have belonged to saints or heroes, their Damascus blades regarded as relics. In Russia, some pieces entered imperial collections through diplomatic gifts and were later subsumed into Soviet museums. Each blade carried stories that grew with every retelling. Some were said to have cut silk in midair. Others were believed to have been tempered in secret baths of rare herbs. Such legends were nearly impossible to verify, but revealed how powerfully Damascus steel captured imagination long after its production ceased. In the 20th century, the study of these last authentic blades became a small academic discipline in its own right. Metallurgists conducted microstructural analyses. Historians traced their trade routes. Anthropologists recorded the fading memories of smithing families. Together, these efforts confirmed that no single person or place had fully owned the Damascus secret. It was a shared legacy, built by centuries of exchange among India, Persia, Arabia, and Europe. The final chapters of the story also reflected broader themes of technological change. Damascus steel did not disappear because it was inferior. It disappeared because the world's economic and social system shifted. Mass production demanded uniformity, speed, and predictability. The slow, uncertain rhythms of the crucible forge no longer suited the demands of an industrial age. Yet even as the process ended, the value of the blades grew. Collectors in Europe and America paid astonishing sums to acquire them. Forged as weapons, they became artifacts, objects of use turned into objects of contemplation. One could say that the last true Damascus blades never entirely left the world. They simply changed their purpose. No longer tools of war, they became silent teachers. They reminded modern makers that some knowledge exists beyond recipes and specifications, that some skills can be documented but not fully replicated. And so, in museum displays and private collections, the last Damascus blades remained, neither alive nor fully dead, but suspended in a state of quiet endurance. They testified to the centuries of trial and error, of inspiration and discipline, of culture and craft. They embodied the paradox of Damascus steel itself, both singular and collective, scientific and artistic, historical and timeless. These were the final pages in the forging of a legend. Yet each time a visitor paused before a glass case and traced the rippling patterns with their eyes, the story began again, endlessly renewed in wonder. Chapter 8: The European Pursuit. As Damascus steel passed into legend, the fascination it inspired only grew more intense. From the late 18th century through the 19th, European metallurgists became determined to replicate what had been lost. Their efforts reflected both scientific curiosity and a cultural hunger for mastery over a material that had humbled so many forges. In England, the Industrial Revolution had transformed metallurgy, introducing more consistent crucible steels pioneered by Benjamin Huntsman in Sheffield. This technology allowed manufacturers to produce high-quality tool steel in quantity. Yet when English smiths attempted to forge blades with the distinctive rippling patterns, they encountered failure after failure. Huntsman's crucible steel was extremely pure, lacking the high carbon variability and the trace impurities that gave Woods its unique microstructure. German metallurgists in Solingen, already famous for sword making, tried different approaches. Some folded and twisted bands of soft iron and high carbon steel, hoping to imitate the appearance. These pattern-welded blades were handsome and functional, but their layered construction could not produce the same carbide networks. In microscopic cross-section, the difference was unmistakable. French experimenters went further. During Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt and the Levant, military savants collected samples of genuine Damascus swords. Upon returning to France, they subjected them to early forms of metallographic analysis, grinding, polishing, and etching sections to reveal their internal structure. They noted the dendritic arrangements and carbide clusters, but could not explain how they formed or how to reproduce them. Part of the problem lay in Europe's own industrial methods. Blast furnaces produced massive quantities of pig iron and wrought iron, but struggled to control the high carbon content essential to Damascus steel. Early crucible processes, meanwhile, favored uniformity over the heterogeneity that created the rippling patterns. Even when European smelters experimented with carbon-rich iron, they found it prone to cracking under the hammer. In the mid-19th century, the development of microscopy provided the first real breakthroughs. Henry Clifton Sorby, an English microscopist, made painstaking studies of polished steel samples under reflected light. His work revealed that Damascus blades contained bands of cementite arranged in a strikingly regular structure. Sorby demonstrated that these patterns were not surface decoration, but the direct consequence of internal transformations during forging and slow cooling. While this explained what created the patterns, it still did not reveal how the old smiths had controlled them. No one in Europe possessed the lived experience to recognize, by eye and hand, the exact moment to reheat, hammer, and anneal to preserve the microstructure. Thus, even with better understanding, no workshop could consistently replicate the effect. Meanwhile, collectors across Britain, France, and Germany competed to acquire authentic examples. Auctions in London sometimes feature Damascus blades alongside ancient Greek bronzes and Egyptian artifacts. Wealthy aristocrats displayed the swords as symbols of cosmopolitan taste and a connection to the lost technologies of the East. A new wave of myths flourished in this environment. Some catalogs declared the blades to be the product of meteoric iron. Others claimed that the knowledge had perished with the fall of Constantinople, conflating the Ottoman capture of the city with the decline of Damascus forging. A few authors argued that secret alloys had been smuggled out of India, but never properly revealed. Throughout the 19th century, the British colonial presence in India gradually brought European metallurgists closer to the source of woods. Colonial administrators documented the crucible steelmakers of the Deccan Plateau. They described the process of packing wrought iron and wood in sealed clay crucibles and heating them until molten, a method unchanged for centuries. Specimens were shipped to London for analysis. Yet by the time these investigations began in earnest, the old Indian industry was itself in decline. As cheaper European steels flooded markets, demand for woods dwindled. Many Indian smelters closed, and the specialized knowledge of controlling carbon content began to disappear. The same economic and technological pressures that had ended Damascus forging were now erasing its Indian origins. Thus, Europe's pursuit of Damascus steel turned into a kind of race against time. Even as scientists learned more about the alloy's chemistry and microstructure, the living practices that produced it were vanishing. Observers could record recipes and temperatures, but the subtleties, the small adjustments made by a master's intuition, slipped away unpreserved. In the end, no 19th century workshop fully recovered the original craft. European smiths developed excellent steels by other means, including Sheffield crucible steel and later Bessemer process steel. Yet the precise marriage of woods and hand forging that created the flowing Damascus patterns remained elusive. The European pursuit of Damascus steel was both a triumph of early materials science and a testament to the limits of analysis without practice. The last fragments of authentic Wootz blades now rested in museums and private collections, mute reminders of a vanished mastery, and the centuries of longing it inspired in all who tried to bring it back to life. Chapter 9. The Sleeping Forge. As the 20th century dawned, the memory of Damascus steel still lingered, less as a technical challenge and more as a myth wrapped in iron and time. In museums across Europe, glass cases displayed swords once carried by generals, sultans, and crusaders, their edges dulled by age, but their wave-like patterns still gleaming faintly under gallery lights. They were relics of a time when steel was shaped slowly, with hands that remembered more than they could explain. Scholars and collectors preserved the blades, but not the knowledge that had made them. The workshops in Damascus that once glowed with firelight and rang with hammer blows were quiet. Many had been converted into shops or homes. Others stood abandoned, their bellows stilled. The steel that had once brought empires to awe had faded into obscurity. In India, the last crucible furnaces, where Wootz ingots had been born, also fell silent. The intricate knowledge of ore selection, charcoal composition, and firing duration, once passed from father to son, was increasingly viewed as backward or irrelevant in an age of industrial mass production. Railroads now carried cheap British steel through the subcontinent. Villages that once supported generations of steelmakers turned to other trades or vanished altogether. The few remaining smiths who still remembered fragments of the witch tradition were aging. In places like Mysore and Hyderabad, old men recalled their fathers packing crucibles or tending long, slow fires. But with no apprentices willing to learn a process that had no commercial future, even these memories began to fade. The forge had gone to sleep, not with a bang, but with the hush of modernity. Back in Europe and America, however, interest in Damascus steel never completely died. In fact, the very mystery of its disappearance gave it new allure. Writers, scientists, and even novelists continued to reference the blades, sometimes accurately, often imaginatively. Damascus steel entered the realm of metaphor, a symbol of forgotten wisdom, of ancient genius that modern minds struggled to comprehend. In Germany, metallurgists examined museum specimens under more advanced microscopes, mapping the grain boundaries and carbide distributions in unprecedented detail. In America, blacksmithing enthusiasts began experimenting with steel patterns of their own, using layered forging techniques to create blades that resembled the originals in beauty, if not in internal structure. These modern imitations, often labeled as Damascus in style, rekindled public curiosity, even as they perpetuated confusion over what the original really was. Academic papers from the early 20th century tried to parse the difference. Some focused on carbon content and carbide precipitation. Others theorized that trace elements like vanadium or molybdenum, naturally occurring in some Indian ores, had played a crucial role. The discussions grew more technical but less connected to lived experience. There were fewer and fewer people who had actually forged such a blade, and more who had only studied one under a lens. Still, the mystery refused to rest. The resilience of Damascus steel, how it held its edge, how it flexed without breaking, how its beauty survived the centuries, kept drawing new minds into the search. Occasionally, a rumor would circulate that someone, somewhere, had rediscovered the secret. A blacksmith in Russia, a metallurgist in Boston, a forgotten manuscript in a library in Aleppo. But each claim dissolved under scrutiny. None could reproduce the precise structure, the exact resilience, the unmistakable flow of pattern that marked the finest original blades. Most relied on different steels, different processes, and a modern mindset. Efficient, precise, but disconnected from the centuries of intuition that had once guided the hammer. The sleeping forge became a symbol, a metaphor for knowledge not lost through catastrophe, but neglected through convenience. For an age when the slow was replaced by the fast, the careful by the scalable, the master's workshop by the factory line. Damascus steel had not failed, it had been left behind. And yet the blade still spoke. In museums and private collections, they whispered to blacksmiths and scientists alike. Their curves invited replication. Their edges teased comparison. Their patterns hinted at deeper layers, not just of steel, but of thought, rhythm, and time. The world was changing, but the legend of Damascus steel remained, like embers beneath ash, waiting for a wind or a hand to stir them to life again. Chapter 14, Damascus Steel in Modern Imagination. As the 21st century advanced, the legend of Damascus steel evolved beyond metallurgy into something more symbolic. It came to represent the delicate intersection of art and science, of tradition and innovation, a testament to the hidden sophistication of pre-modern craftspeople. In literature and film, the Damascus blade became an emblem of mastery and mystery. Fantasy novels described heroes wielding swords with edges so sharp they could part a strand of hair or shatter lesser weapons. Historical fiction portrayed smiths as near-magical figures, whispering secret prayers over the crucibles. Hollywood productions borrowed the name freely, using Damascus steel as shorthand for anything ancient and powerful, whether or not the object resembled the true material. The actual knowledge of how real Wood's blades were forged remained confined to a smaller community of researchers and artisans. In universities, metallurgy students studied the micrographs of authentic Damascus blades, learning how to recognize the signature banding of cementite. Some went further, conducting experimental smelts in modern crucibles with rigorously controlled temperatures and carefully prepared ores. In these labs, the legacy of Damascus steel was treated less as a legend and more as an unresolved scientific question. How exactly did the slow cooling of molten metal and the unique chemistry of Indian ores produce such a stable, beautiful distribution of carbon? Why did the process resist duplication, even with contemporary equipment? The blades had crossed centuries of human history, yet their secrets still challenge the precision of modern analysis. Meanwhile, in the realm of artisanal bladesmithing, Damascus-inspired knives enjoyed a renaissance. Modern smiths continued developing layered steel techniques, creating blades of remarkable beauty, even if the microstructure differed from the originals. Pattern-welded steel, sometimes called modern Damascus, grew popular among chefs, collectors, and outdoor enthusiasts. Some artisans experimented with layering different alloys to achieve more elaborate visual effects: stars, waves, spirals, and organic lines. Others pursued performance, refining heat treatment protocols to create blades as tough as they were striking. Even though the chemistry no longer matched crucible woods, the spirit of combining form and function endured. In Japan, master swordsmiths compared Damascus's legacy to their own Tamahagane steel traditions, where smelting, folding, and forging produced blades renowned for resilience and cutting power. Though the processes evolved separately, both cultures had discovered that slow, iterative refinement could yield materials no single melting or casting step could match. In Europe and North America, public exhibitions of Damascus swords continued to draw crowds. Museums began to design displays that showed not only the blades themselves, but also the steps of their creation. Video demonstrations looped footage of modern crucible experiments, while magnified photos revealed the flowing microstructures that had captivated scientists and collectors alike. These exhibits often emphasized that the allure of Damascus steel was as much about process as product. A sword's pattern told a story, not merely of carbon and iron, but of centuries of observation, trial, and intuition. It was a story that wove through cultures and empires, crossing deserts and oceans before it reached the hands of those who sought to understand it. Damascus steel also inspired modern artists and designers far removed from blacksmithing. Jewelry makers used the layered look in rings and bracelets. Architects referenced the watery motifs in decorative panels. Even tech companies borrowed the name to evoke strength and elegance, proof that the legend had become an idea larger than any single object. And so, the meaning of Damascus steel continued to evolve. It no longer belonged only to the past. It was a bridge between the ancient forge and the modern workshop, between the tangible blade and the intangible idea of mastery. It reminded people that progress is not always a straight line of improvement. Sometimes, it is a circle of forgetting and rediscovery. One might argue that the persistence of a legend was itself a form of immortality. The blade survived wars and empires, changing tastes and technologies. The old methods decayed, but the fascination endured, proving that even when craft knowledge fades, the desire to understand it can flourish across centuries. For the scientists, Damascus steel remained a tantalizing subject, rich in unsolved details. For the smiths, it was a call to patience and humility. For the public, it was a story, part truth, part myth, entirely compelling. And in the quiet halls where the last genuine blades rested, one could stand before the rippled patterns and feel, for a moment, the echo of the old fires. The forge glowing in the night, the hammer's rhythm against the anvil, the smith's breath held as liquid iron cooled into something more than metal. This was the legacy Damascus steel carried into the modern imagination. Not just an object, but an invitation to wonder. Chapter 15, Lessons from the Blade. As the world moved deeper into the digital age, the fascination with Damascus steel persisted in unexpected ways. Scientists continued to study it as a case of historical materials engineering. Craftsmen honored it as a pinnacle of human skill. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Damascus steel was not simply the blades themselves. It was the broader lesson they offer about how knowledge is created, transmitted, and sometimes lost. In universities, courses in the history of technology began to include Damascus steel alongside other milestones of material science: Roman concrete, Chinese porcelain, Japanese tamahagane. Students were taught that great advances often emerged not from sudden inventions, but from centuries of cumulative observation. No single genius had invented Damascus steel. Instead, countless anonymous smiths had learned to listen to the metal, adjusting fire, timing, and technique until the blade revealed its secrets. This slow evolution became a powerful counterpoint to modern ideas of progress. Where contemporary manufacturing valued uniformity and speed, the Damascus process required variation and patience. In an era defined by automation, the story of these blades suggested that true mastery sometimes depended on a willingness to proceed by feel rather than formula. Among bladesmiths, this philosophy resonated deeply. Workshops sprang up around the world where artisans rejected mass production in favor of hand forging. Some tried to replicate the crucible process as faithfully as possible, collecting high-carbon iron sands, building clay furnaces, and tending slow, charcoal-rich fires. Others developed hybrid approaches, combining old techniques with modern metallurgical knowledge to create blades that honored the past while embracing new possibilities. These smiths spoke of Damascus steel less as a mystery to be solved and more as a conversation to be continued. They recognized that the process would never be identical to what came before. Materials had changed, so had contexts, but the impulse to shape something lasting and beautiful through deliberate care remained as relevant as ever. At the same time, historians and anthropologists worked to preserve the intangible heritage of Damascus steel. They recorded oral histories from families in India and Iran who had once traded or forged the ingots. They translated old treatises into accessible modern languages, ensuring that even if the exact processes could not be revived, their memory would not disappear entirely. Museums expanded their exhibits to include not only finished blades, but the broader ecosystem that sustained them. The mines, the trading caravans, the workshops, the rituals of apprenticeship. These contextual displays helped visitors understand that the blade was not just a product, but the visible edge of a vast and intricate network of knowledge. Meanwhile, material scientists continued to refine their understanding of the microstructures that gave Damascus steel its singular properties. High-resolution imaging and computer modeling revealed new details about the cementite arrangements and the ways in which trace elements might have influenced carbide stability. Even after 2 centuries of study, the blades still held questions, tiny mysteries embedded in their shimmering patterns. For the broader public, Damascus steel retained its aura of romance. It appeared in novels, video games, and documentaries. It inspired metaphors in business and technology. The idea that something could be both strong and flexible, both precise and elegant. And in this cultural afterlife, Damascus steel became something larger than metallurgy. It became a reminder that no knowledge is truly permanent. Even the most refined techniques can slip away if the conditions that sustain them, social, economic, environmental, begin to erode. It also showed that knowledge can be revived in new forms if enough curiosity and respect remain. In the end, the story of Damascus steel was never only about a blade's edge. It was about the edge between remembering and forgetting, between utility and beauty, between the known and the possible. Visitors to the great museums could still stand before Damascus sword and see, in the flowing ripples, the labor of thousands of lives. The miner who dug the ore, the smelter who watched the crucible glow, the trader who carried the ingots over desert passes, the smith who judged by color and sound when to quench and when to draw. All of them left traces in the steel. All of them contributed to a legacy that, even in fragments, endures. And as long as people keep wondering how it was made and why it mattered, the story of Damascus steel will remain alive, not simply as a technological achievement, but as a testament to the human capacity to transform the raw and ordinary into the remarkable. Thank you for joining this journey through the story of Damascus steel, a story that reminds us how knowledge can rise, vanish, and return in unexpected ways. These legendary blades were more than weapons. They were symbols of patience, ingenuity, and the quiet brilliance of human hands working alongside nature. May their legacy inspire us to honor the craft in all we create, to look deeper into the past for lessons that still shape our future, and to celebrate the beauty hidden in every detail.